a move that unfolded not over weeks or months, but in a matter of hours. Hours that changed the calculus of nuclear deterrence, hours that forced the White House into emergency mode, hours that reminded the world just how dangerous this moment in history truly is. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line that Washington had hoped would hold, and when that line broke, Volodymyr Zelensky did not hesitate. He responded with defiance, clarity, and an unmistakable message that Ukraine will not be intimidated, not by threats, not by posturing, and certainly not by nuclear blackmail. What you are about to hear is not speculation. It is not analysis based on rumors. It is the detailed account of what happened today, why it happened, and what it means for every nation watching this crisis unfold. Because tonight, the stakes are no longer theoretical, they are real, they are immediate, and they demand our attention. For several months now, there had been signals, not official statements, not formal diplomatic warnings, just signals that Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain rhythm, a pattern, almost a script. But what set off alarm bells in Washington this week was that the pattern went silent. Intelligence analysts who monitor Russian military communications know the indicators, the unusual movement of strategic assets, the encrypted traffic between Moscow and nuclear command centers, the positioning of mobile missile launchers, the sudden cancellation of routine military exercises. All of that went quiet, and whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Senior officials at the Pentagon and the National Security Council had been tracking these developments for days. They knew that Russia's recent battlefield losses in Ukraine had created pressure on the Kremlin. They knew that Putin's domestic political situation was becoming increasingly fragile, and they knew that a cornered leader with nuclear weapons is the most dangerous variable in any conflict. But what they did not expect was how quickly Putin would move, or how far he would go. Early this morning, U.S. intelligence assets detected what they described as unprecedented nuclear posturing, including the activation of command and control systems that had not been brought online in over 15 years. These are the kinds of assets that Russia only deploys when they are signaling something very specific: escalation, intimidation, or preparation. Analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once, but what they did know was that Putin was changing Russia's nuclear posture. And when a nuclear power shifts its posture without explanation, even by a small measure, the entire world pays attention. Within hours, Putin addressed the Russian people in a televised statement. His words were measured, but his message was unmistakable. He spoke of Western aggression, he spoke of NATO expansion, he spoke of Russia's right to defend itself by any means necessary. And then he said it. He said that Russia reserves the right to use nuclear weapons if its territorial integrity is threatened, and that he considers the occupied regions of Ukraine to be Russian territory. The implication was clear. Any Ukrainian attempt to liberate its own land could now trigger a nuclear response. This was not saber-rattling. This was a direct, explicit nuclear threat issued to the entire world. The warning issued by the White House tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Official after official described Putin's move as reckless, dangerous, and perhaps most importantly, inconsistent with the behavior of a rational nuclear actor, but intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Zelensky did not. In fact, his response today was among the most defiant we've seen since the war began. Here's what we know. Within hours of Putin's nuclear threat, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian parliament and issued a statement that was broadcast to the world. These weren't the cautious, diplomatic words of a leader seeking to de-escalate. These were the words of a wartime president who understood that backing down now would be the beginning of the end. Zelensky declared that Ukraine would not be blackmailed. He declared that Ukraine would continue to liberate every inch of its territory, and he declared that the world must not allow nuclear threats to become an acceptable tool of foreign policy. His defiance was immediate, his message was clear, and his resolve was absolute. Tonight, the Pentagon confirmed that Ukraine launched major military operations on multiple fronts, including strikes on Russian positions in occupied territories that had recently been reinforced for what analysts believe was defensive preparation against a Ukrainian counteroffensive. Ukraine struck before Russia could consolidate. They hit command centers, they hit ammunition depots, they hit logistics hubs that were likely preparing to support Russian reinforcements. In other words, Ukraine targeted the infrastructure of Russian occupation, the systems that would have allowed Russia to hold the territory it claims as its own. This is what made Putin's threat so urgent. Russia's nuclear posturing wasn't just symbolic. It was designed to freeze the battlefield in place. It represented the kind of move that could give Russia permanent control of occupied Ukrainian territory if left unchecked, and Zelensky, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. He didn't attack Russian territory, he didn't target Russian civilians, he hit military positions, he hit supply lines, he hit the machinery of occupation that Russia has built on Ukrainian soil. And in doing so, he sent a message that nuclear threats will not determine the outcome of this war. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence analysts now believe that Putin's nuclear threat was designed to test the resolve of the West after months of war fatigue and domestic political challenges in key NATO countries. Putin wanted to see whether the United States would pressure Ukraine to halt its counteroffensive. But instead, the opposite happened. Washington didn't pressure Kyiv to stand down. They issued a statement of support that was so immediate, so unequivocal, that even Moscow noticed you don't get Putin's attention easily. But today, the Western alliance did. Defense officials speaking with major news outlets under anonymity described Putin's shift as nuclear coercion, a way to achieve through threats what Russia could not achieve on the battlefield. But Ukraine proved today that they remain both capable and determined. Their military operations were not only effective, they were calibrated so precisely that they maximized pressure on Russian positions while minimizing the risk of escalation. That calibration matters because it shows strategic discipline. It shows that Ukraine is not simply reacting to Russia's moves. They are anticipating them, they are preparing for them, and they are defeating them. As reports continued coming in throughout the day, we learned more about the scale of Ukraine's response. Ukrainian ground forces carried out coordinated assaults on multiple sectors of the front line, forcing Russian units to fall back to secondary defensive positions. Ukrainian air defense units targeted Russian aircraft that had been repositioned in the last 72 hours. Ukrainian special operations forces, operating deep behind enemy lines, reportedly disrupted communications infrastructure used by Russia to coordinate its defensive operations. This wasn't just a counterattack. This wasn't just a show of force. This was strategic momentum. This was battlefield initiative. And battlefield initiative is the one thing Russia has struggled to maintain since the early months of the invasion. For every advance Russia has made, Ukraine has countered with something that complicates their position. For every threat Putin has issued, Zelensky has responded with action. And tonight that pattern continued. Remember, Putin thought NATO would fracture under pressure. He thought European energy dependence would force compromise. He thought Ukraine would collapse within weeks. He thought the West would lose interest. He thought nuclear threats would paralyze decision-making. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. NATO is more unified than it has been in decades. Europe is accelerating its energy transition away from Russian dependence. Ukraine has not only survived, it is fighting back. And the West has responded to nuclear threats not with paralysis, but with resolve. History will record this moment as a turning point, not because of what Putin said, but because of how the world responded. What makes this moment so dangerous and so consequential is that Putin's nuclear threat happened at a time when the Russian president is under extraordinary pressure. Hardliners in Moscow want escalation. Pragmatists want a negotiated settlement. Military commanders want more resources. Oligarchs want the sanctions lifted. And the Russian public is growing weary of a war that was supposed to be over in days. Putin is balancing these demands while facing battlefield setbacks that challenge the very narrative of Russian military supremacy. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength, they're doing it from pressure, they're doing it from vulnerability. That doesn't make the situation less dangerous, it makes it more dangerous. Because vulnerable leaders are unpredictable leaders, and unpredictable leaders with nuclear weapons are the most dangerous actors on the world stage. The White House statement, now distributed to every major news organization in the world, was designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow nuclear blackmail to succeed. Officials said plainly that Putin's threat was inconsistent with responsible nuclear stewardship. That is diplomatic language for this is unacceptable and there will be consequences. You don't usually hear that tone from Washington unless something serious is at stake. Secretary of State officials confirmed that emergency consultations have been held with NATO allies. Defense Department officials confirmed that U.S. strategic forces remain at heightened readiness, and National Security Council officials confirmed that contingency planning is underway for multiple scenarios. The message from Washington was clear: we will not be intimidated, we will not abandon our allies, and we will respond appropriately to any escalation. Meanwhile, Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people and the world in a powerful emotional speech tonight. He said, "We will not be blackmailed by those who have already destroyed so much of our country." He said, "Every threat is an admission of weakness. Every escalation is a sign of desperation." And he said, "Ukraine will be free. Every village, every city, every inch of our land will be liberated. And no threat, nuclear or otherwise, will change that." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a nation that understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky's defiance tonight was not just for domestic consumption, it was a message to the world. It was a statement that courage is still possible, that tyranny can still be resisted, that threats can still be faced, and Ukraine proved tonight that they intend to face them. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's nuclear threat wasn't isolated. Along with the nuclear posturing, Russian cyber units also launched attacks on Ukrainian infrastructure. Belarusian forces increased military exercises near the Ukrainian border. Russian state media increased its rhetoric targeting Western capitals. All of this happened within the same 24-hour period. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. This is not improvisation, this is coordination. And coordination on this scale requires planning, which means Russia has been preparing for this moment. The question now is, preparing for what? Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a major offensive designed to regain battlefield momentum. Another is that Putin is attempting to create enough fear to force negotiations on terms favorable to Russia. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to establish a new norm where nuclear threats are an acceptable tool of statecraft. But today, Zelensky took that card off the table. He didn't pause military operations. He didn't call for emergency negotiations. He didn't show any sign of fear. He accelerated. He pushed harder. He proved that Ukraine cannot be intimidated. And in doing so, he may have prevented the normalization of nuclear blackmail. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see whether threats can achieve what his army cannot. Zelensky wants to show that courage is stronger than fear. Washington wants to prevent nuclear escalation, and the world wants to prevent the return of an era where might makes right. The outcome of this test will shape international relations for decades. If nuclear threats work, every authoritarian with nuclear weapons will learn the lesson. If they don't work, the rules-based international order survives. The stakes could not be higher. Tonight, we've heard from Pentagon officials who are now monitoring Russian nuclear forces around the clock. They say there has been no indication of imminent nuclear weapons deployment. They say that Russian strategic forces remain at baseline readiness despite the rhetoric. And they say Putin's decision to issue this threat is likely part of a broader psychological campaign intended to fracture Western unity. But the West is not fracturing. In fact, the West is consolidating. Ukraine's response today, swift, strategic, and defiant, sent a message to Putin that threats will not work. And it sent a message to Washington that Ukraine remains a capable and determined partner. Tonight, the alliance holds. Tonight, the resistance continues. Tonight, Ukraine fights on. As the days go on, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this unprecedented nuclear threat. But what we do know is that the White House response was timely, it reinforced deterrence, it supported allies, and it sent a clear message that nuclear blackmail will not be rewarded. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 72 hours. If he de-escalates, this moment will be remembered as a crisis managed. If he escalates further, the United States and its allies have already shown they are prepared. They have shown they are united. They have shown they are ready to respond. And tonight, for the first time in months, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet, it means he is thinking, it means he is choosing his next move carefully. Because tonight, Putin learned something he has learned many times before but keeps forgetting. Threats are not a substitute for strength. Intimidation is not a substitute for strategy. And nuclear blackmail is not a path to victory. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear. Ukraine is not backing down. The West is not fracturing. And the world is watching.